Now, it is worth mentioning that I also touched on hooks throughout this course. So some of the hooks I'll dive deeper into in this module are hooks I already mentioned throughout this course, but then I always mentioned that we will dive into it later. Well, now is that later. Now we will dive in more detail. And let's start with the ingredient form.js file. There we have a couple of inputs. And one thing we typically would do here is that we bind the input the user enters to some state property, and we update that state on every keystroke and then send the value back into the input, right? That's that two-way binding you'll learn about in this course, and we did this multiple times when we work with inputs. I want to do the same here because ultimately it all starts in this app here with us gathering the user input so that we can make this add ingredient button work, so that we do something useful when this button is pressed. Now, if you wouldn't know about hooks, or if you would use React 16.7 or earlier, then you would have to transform this to a class-based component and use state and set state there. Now with React hooks, you don't have to do that. Instead, you can import something new from React by not just importing the default export, which is that React object, but by importing a named export, and that is usestate. I mentioned that all these hooks start with use, and then they have various names. So here it's the usestate hook. And this is a crucial, probably the core hook provided by React. It allows us to manage state in functional components. It works a bit different than state and class-based components, but we'll see the difference in a second. So how do we use it then? Well, we go into our functional component, and that's important. You have to use it in your functional component body. So let's say here, and we call usestate. Now that alone doesn't do much though. Usestate can be initialized with a default state, and that state can be anything. Can be an object, can be an array, can be a number, can be a string, a boolean, can be any value. It doesn't have to be an object, it can be any value. So here we could create a new state that should manage the input for the title and the amount. So let's create an object here. Again, doesn't have to be an object. I choose to use one here because I have two values which I want to manage. And that would be title, and initially it's an empty string, and amount. And let's set amount also to an empty string. Now, you could argue that this should store a number, and hence you want to set it to 0 or something like that initially. But actually, managing this will be easier if we set it to a string, because input elements, the values of input elements, are always strings. Even if it's of type number, we'll always get a string. If we would want to work with a number in our app, then we would simply have to convert that value whenever we use it. But when we fetch it, when we manage it, managing it as a string avoids some strange side effects where we might not be able to edit this value in the way we want to. So both values here are strings. And now, of course, the question is, what does this get us? What does this usestate call do? Because just that alone, of course, won't set up a connection between, well, our state we're trying to manage here and our inputs. Now, usestate actually returns something. This here might be complicated to read, but this in the end describes how this function, the usestate function, is defined. And after this colon here, we see the return value. And we see that the return value actually is an array, and it's an array with exactly 2 elements. And that's important. Usestate, this built-in hook, always returns an array with exactly 2 elements. The first element then always is your current state snapshot. And whenever your state updates, to which I'll come back in a second, this component will rebuild, so this component function is re-executed. And usestate, of course, therefore also is executed again, but React internally saves that you already configured a state with the help of usestate for this component and will not reinitialize it, but instead usestate manages this state detached from your component, so to say, so independent from your component, so that the state survives re-renders of this component, so that the state survives when this component function gets executed again. And therefore, usestate, this first value which is returned here, is your current state snapshot, and it's the current state snapshot for this re-render cycle of this component. This means that when you update the state, you'll get the updated state here. So you get back an array in usestate, and that array has two elements, and the first element is always your current state snapshot, either the initial state, or if you changed it, the updated state. That of course leads us to the question, how do you change the state? How do you update the state? And that's where the second element in this array is helpful. As I mentioned, this array always has exactly two elements. First element is your current state snapshot. Second element is a function that allows you to update your current state. So this here, this strange looking thing, this dispatch thing here, that's a function that will always be a function which you can call with a new data for your state to update that state. So therefore, what we can do here, we can store this array with exactly two elements in a variable or in a constant here actually, because for this render cycle, it's not going to change, hence it can be a constant. And I'll name this input state. The name is totally up to you, but in the end here, we manage everything we need to manage for our, well, state for these two inputs here, hence the name input state. Now that we store our array with the state snapshot and the state updating function here in input state, we can connect it to our inputs. And there I'll use a similar approach I showed you earlier in the course with two-way binding in the end, where we bind the value of this input to the current state snapshot so that we pass the current state back into the input, so to say. And I do this by simply referring to input state and then the first element. Remember, input state is an array with exactly two elements, and the first element at index 0 will be your current state snapshot. So that will be, well, what we want to feed back into the input. Now, of course, our state is an object though, not a string. So for the title input here, I want to access input state 0.title because our state is an object with a title and an amount property to manage, well, input for these two inputs. And for the amount input here, I'll therefore set value equal to input state for the first element, which is our current state snapshot amount. Now we feed the current state for the respective inputs back into the input elements. Of course, we also want to update the state when we type into these inputs though. And for that, just as we do it always, also in class-based components, we can listen to the onChange event, which fires for every keystroke. And there we get this event object. So here I'm executing an anonymous function in the end. We get the event object automatically and we want to update our state. And as I mentioned, we do this with the second element in this array usestate gives us back. So here we access the element at index 1, which is the second element. And this is a function. So we can execute it as a function by adding parentheses here. Now here I'm on the title input, so I want to update the title. So what we do here is we simply pass a new object to input state to update our current state with this new state object. And there we can set the title property to event target value, because event, that's the change event, the target is our input field, and the value property then holds the value the user entered. So let me reformat that. And now repeat that same logic here for the amount input down there. So there we also add onChange, but of course we update the amount field. So with that, if we save this and we go back to our program here, and now I enter apples 5 here, well, we see this generally works. We can type here, which is a good sign, which means we're feeding the state correctly back into these inputs and so on, but we also get a warning that a component is changing a controlled input of type number to be uncontrolled. So what's the reason for this warning? What's wrong about the way we're saving our state here? And why am I getting a warning about the input of type number, which is our second input, if I type into the first one?